Adolf Hitler's greatest tactical failure wasn't a mistake made by a living general, but a lie fed to him by a corpse. In the spring of 1943, the entire weight of World War II rested on the shoulders of a man who was already dead, a ghost tasked with outmaneuvering the most paranoid regime on the planet. This was not a soldier who fell in the heat of battle, nor a spy caught behind enemy lines. He was a silent messenger, a vessel for a deception so audacious that it shifted the map of Europe. Off the coast of Huelva, Spain, the morning fog clung to the waves like a heavy shroud. A local fisherman, scanning the water for his daily catch, spotted something bobbing in the surf. It was a man in a British Royal Marines uniform, life jacket inflated, drifting toward the shore. And his grip was a leather briefcase, chained to his belt as if its contents were more precious than his own life. To the fisherman, it was a tragedy of war, a courier lost at sea. To the German intelligence officers waiting in the shadows of neutral Spain, it was the breakthrough they had been praying for. But to the architects of this operation in London, it was a desperate gamble involving a stolen identity and a body that should have been at rest. The year was 1943, and the Allied forces faced a wall of steel. To reclaim Europe, they had to strike at its soft underbelly, starting with Sicily. The problem was obvious. The German High Command knew this too. The island was a fortress, and any invasion would lead to a slaughter unless the enemy could be convinced to look elsewhere. The British intelligence service, operating from a windowless basement known as Room 13, began to formulate a plan that bordered on the macabre. They didn't need a living spy. They needed a body that could tell a story convincing enough to fool a dictator. The operation was born from a memo inspired by a detective novel, a suggestion that a body dropped at sea with fake documents could lead the enemy into a trap. It was called the Trout Memo, comparing the deception to fly fishing, where the lure must look indistinguishable from the truth. Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley were the two men tasked with finding their trout. They needed a body that looked as if it had died in a plane crash at sea, one that could withstand the scrutiny of a Spanish coroner and the skeptical eyes of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence. Finding a body in wartime London was easy, but finding the right one was a haunting challenge. They couldn't use a soldier whose family would miss him, nor someone whose cause of death would be obvious under a microscope. They eventually looked toward the forgotten corners of society, settling on a man whose life had been defined by isolation and misfortune. His name was Glyndwr Michael. He had arrived in London from Wales, a drifter with no prospects, and had met a quiet end in a warehouse after consuming rat poison. In the eyes of the state, he was a man who belonged to no one. In the eyes of intelligence, he was the perfect canvas. The transformation of Glyndwr Michael into Major William Martin was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Montague and Cholmondeley didn't just give him a name, they gave him a soul. They filled his pockets with the mundane clutter of a life. A receipt for a new shirt, stubs from a London theater, a letter from his bank demanding payment on an overdraft. They created a fiancée named Pam, drafting heartbreaking love letters and including a photograph of a woman who was actually a clerk at the MI5 office. Every scrap of paper was designed to build a profile of a man who was distracted, perhaps a bit careless, but undeniably real. They even included a replacement identity card to explain why his photo looked slightly different, anticipating the granular level of German suspicion. The centerpiece of the deception was the briefcase. Inside were personal letters between high-ranking generals written with a tone of casual intimacy. These letters dropped subtle hints that the real Allied targets were Greece and Sardinia, and that the buildup around Sicily was merely a feint. The language was carefully calibrated to make the German readers feel as though they had stumbled upon a secret they were never meant to see. The documents weren't just lies. They were reflections of what the Germans already feared. The British knew that a lie is most effective when it confirms an existing suspicion. The logistics of the operation were as cold as the body itself. To keep the remains from decaying, they were packed in a custom-built canister filled with dry ice. This was a race against time and biology. The Major was transported in total secrecy to the Holy Loch in Scotland, where he was loaded onto the submarine HMS Seraph. Only the captain of the submarine knew the true nature of the cargo. The crew was told they were transporting a top-secret weather instrument. The atmosphere inside the submarine was thick with tension. The men unaware that they were sharing their cramped quarters with a dead man who held the fate of the Mediterranean in his frozen hands. Under the cover of darkness on April 30th, the Seraph surfaced off the Spanish coast. The water was calm, the air biting. The captain read a psalm over the body as it was gently slid into the water. The outgoing tide took him toward the shore, carrying the life story of a fictional hero in a locked leather bag. Now the British could only wait. They had cast their lure into the dark waters of international espionage, hoping that the Spanish would hand the documents to the Germans and that the Germans would believe the ghost. In Spain, the tension was palpable. The Spanish authorities recovered the body and the briefcase, but British agents had to play a delicate game of reverse psychology. They had to act desperate to get the briefcase back without making it look like they wanted the Germans to see it. They sent urgent, unencrypted telegrams demanding the return of the documents, knowing the Germans were intercepting every word. The more the British scrambled and panicked over the airwaves, the more certain the Germans became that its contents were the keys to the kingdom. It was a performance of incompetence played to an audience of experts. The documents eventually made their way to the desk of Alexis Baron von Roene, a key figure in German military intelligence. Von Roene was known for his analytical mind, but he was also a man navigating the internal politics of a crumbling regime. Whether he fully believed the deception or simply found it too compelling to ignore remains a point of historical debate. Regardless, the intelligence was passed up the chain of command, eventually reaching the desk of the Führer himself. Hitler, who had always been obsessed with the idea of a Mediterranean invasion, saw the documents as confirmation of his own instincts. He took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The result was a monumental shift in the German defense. Divisions were moved from Sicily to Greece and Sardinia. Tanks, planes, and thousands of troops were relocated to defend against a ghost. The beaches of Sicily, which should have been a meat grinder for Allied troops, were suddenly vulnerable. When the Allied fleet finally appeared on the horizon of Sicily in July 1943, the defenders were caught in a state of utter confusion. The soft underbelly was even softer than anticipated, and the liberation of Italy began with far fewer casualties than anyone had dared to hope. Thousands of young men lived because one dead man had been sent to do the impossible. But while the world eventually celebrated a tactical genius, the man who made it possible remained a shadow. Glyndwr Michael was buried in Huelva under the name Major William Martin, with full military honors. For decades, the true identity of the man in the water was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. His family, if they even knew he was gone, had no idea that his final act was to save the lives of thousands of men he had never met. The tragic irony of his life, a man who had no place in society while alive, finding a position of world-altering importance only after his death, remains one of the most haunting aspects of the tale. The operation, known as Mincemeat, is often cited as the perfect spy story. It was a victory of imagination over brute force, of a lie so well told that it became a functional truth. Yet there is a lingering darkness to the tale that no amount of military glory can erase. It is the story of a man who was failed by society and life, only to be used as a cold tool by the state in death. His identity was systematically erased, replaced by a fictional hero created in a London basement. The letters from Pam, the bank notices, the theater tickets, they were all artifacts of a life that never existed, draped over a man who had been forgotten by everyone except the men who needed his corpse. Historical records eventually revealed the truth of Glyndwr Michael's identity in the 1990s, and a small inscription was added to his gravestone in Spain. It acknowledges his real name and his service, however involuntary it may have been. But the mystery of the Major still haunts the annals of intelligence. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable ethics of war, the idea that a single life, even one lived in the margins, can be treated as a piece of military equipment for the greater good. It asks us where the line is drawn between strategic brilliance and the desecration of the human spirit. The success of the operation didn't just depend on the documents, it depended on the German belief in British incompetence. The architects of Mincemeat knew that if the lie was too perfect, it would be suspicious. They had to make Major Martin look like a human being, flawed, slightly disorganized, and relatable. They banked on the idea that the German officers would see a bit of themselves in this tragic officer who had lost his life while carrying the world's secrets. They understood that the most effective way to hide a secret is to wrap it in a layer of mundane, human tragedy. As the years pass, the details of the operation have been dramatized and analyzed, yet the core of the story remains a chilling testament to the power of narrative. It reminds us that in the world of shadows, the most effective weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but a story that the enemy wants to believe. The corpse that fooled Hitler didn't just win a campaign. It proved that the human mind is often more vulnerable than any fortress. The ghost of Major William Martin still drifts in the collective memory, a silent reminder that sometimes the most significant players in history are the ones who never even knew they were part of the game. The operation's legacy is one of calculated coldness and brilliant execution. It raises questions that remain unanswered to this day about the lengths a nation will go to ensure its survival. Was it a noble sacrifice of a man who had nothing left? Or was it a final indignity visited upon a defenseless soul? There are no easy answers in the dark thriller of real-world intelligence. There is only the result, an invasion that succeeded, a dictator who was deceived, and a quiet grave in Spain that holds a secret the world was never supposed to find. Even now, military theorists study mincemeat as the gold standard of strategic deception. It is a reminder that in the theater of war, the stage is often set long before the first shot is fired. The actors aren't always living, and the script is often written in the ink of a life that never was. The story of Glyndwr Michael is a dark mirror held up to the face of conflict, showing us that the greater good often requires the most intimate of betrayals. In the end, the deception worked because it was built on a foundation of human truth. The letters, the photos, and the mundane details of Major Martin's life were more convincing than any high-level intelligence report. The Germans didn't just see a body, they saw a man. And in that recognition of humanity, they failed to see the trap. The operation remains a masterclass in the art of the lie, a reminder that the most profound changes in history can sometimes be triggered by a single silent messenger drifting toward a lonely shore. When you look at the markers of victory in World War II, remember the man in the water. He was the soldier who never fought, the spy who never spoke, and the ghost who broke the back of a regime with nothing but a pocket full of lies.